Grace Whitmore stood at the top of New York's corporate ladder, only 34, and already leading a multi-billion-dollar healthcare empire. Her name carried weight in the city, her sharp heels echoed through marble hallways, and her presence commanded every boardroom. Yet behind the tailored suits and flawless presentations was a woman who walked into an empty penthouse each night. Her success was undeniable, but her family's whispers never ceased. To them, she was a daughter who had climbed too fast, a sister who had taken a seat that did not belong to her. They questioned her judgment, doubted her resolve, and waited for the moment she might stumble. The company she led was preparing to launch Health Trust, a platform designed to transform the way hospitals shared patient data. It was her vision. Years of work condensed into one system that could change lives. The launch promised headlines and a surge of confidence on Wall Street. But, in the shadows of her family's grand estate, another narrative was taking shape. Veronica Whitmore, her older sister, smiled politely in public while weaving a quiet alliance with Damian Cross, a financier known for dismantling companies and selling the parts for profit. To Grace, Health Trust was a promise to her late mother's ideals. To Veronica, it was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Far from the skyscrapers and glass boardrooms, Jack Mercer lived a different life. 37? Once a Navy Special Operations soldier, now the owner of a small security firm that operated more on reputation than advertising. His apartment in Queens was modest, but every corner spoke of life. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, evidence of Maya's 7-year-old imagination. A worn couch bore the marks of family movie nights. The air smelled faintly of apple slices and laundry detergent, not expensive perfume and polished oak. Jack carried himself with quiet discipline, his past written in scars that he never displayed like trophies. He cooked dinner, helped with math homework, and listened to his daughter's piano practice with a patience forged in battlefields far away. Where Grace lived, under the weight of scrutiny, Jack moved in the comfort of simplicity. She had assistants, drivers, and media advisors. He had Maya, a backpack filled with snacks, and a routine that valued bedtime stories over board meetings. Yet, beneath his calm exterior lay instincts that never dulled. He noticed details others missed: the angle of a parked car, the timing of a streetlight, the rhythm of footsteps in a stairwell. Skills that once kept his team alive now protected the quiet life he built for his daughter. The two worlds had never collided, but the storm brewing inside Grace's empire made it inevitable. Anonymous leaks about Health Trust's security began to surface, threatening the launch and dragging her name through scandal. Stock prices dipped, reporters circled, and her family sharpened their knives, ready to claim her crown. Worse still, whispers of sabotage reached her office. The brakes on her car had failed only a week earlier, dismissed as mechanical error. But she knew better. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. In the cold silence of her penthouse one evening, Grace studied the city lights and felt the isolation pressing in. Every ally seemed compromised, every offer of help poisoned by hidden agendas. She realized she would need someone outside the family circle, someone with no stake in her empire, someone who lived by principles rather than profit. And so, unknowingly, the path began to turn toward Jack Mercer, the man whose life could not have been further from hers, yet whose presence would soon become the shield between her and the storm waiting to consume everything she had built. The boardroom on the 42nd floor gleamed with glass and polished wood, but the air inside was heavy, sharp with accusation. Grace Whitmore sat at the head of the table, her posture flawless, her expression calm. But the voices surrounding her cut like blades. Her father, William, leaned forward with the authority of 4 decades in business, his words slow and deliberate as he accused her of betraying the company by selling patient data for profit. Veronica, Her older sister followed with rehearsed precision, citing reports that claimed Health Trust had compromised privacy and endangered lives. One by one, the family members added their voices, each piling on until the weight of their accusations pressed Grace into silence. The evidence was crafted to look damning. Charts of falling stock prices, documents pulled from servers, reports written by hired analysts who had already been paid to reach the desired conclusion. The family lawyer laid out bylaws that would allow for an emergency transfer of power, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Even the chief financial officer, once an ally, joined the chorus, warning that investors would flee unless decisive action was taken. It was less a meeting than a trial, and the verdict seemed predetermined before she had entered the room. Grace held her pen tightly, the one her late mother had given her, a reminder of promises made at a hospital bedside. She answered calmly, insisting the accusations were lies, that no breach had ever occurred. But her words barely carried across the table. The room was stacked against her. Every nod, every whisper, every pointed glance seemed to say she was finished. Inside, her chest burned with humiliation and fury. Outwardly, she remained composed, because weakness was what they expected. Then the sound of the door broke through the noise. It swung open with sudden force, and the storm outside sent rain sliding across the marble floor. Jack Mercer stepped inside, his shirt still damp, his eyes calm like still water after battle. He crossed the room without hesitation, walked behind Grace's chair, and placed one hand on the back of it. His voice, low but clear enough for every ear, cut through the chaos. "Try me." The words landed with a weight no report or accusation could match. The chatter stopped. The smirks faded. For the first time in the entire meeting, Grace felt the tide shift, not in her favor exactly, but away from her complete isolation. The people who had circled her like predators now looked at each other, suddenly uncertain. Grace did not turn to him. Not yet. She kept her gaze on the table, her face steady, but her heart pounded. She did not know this man beyond a short interview and a signed contract, yet in that moment, his presence was a wall between her and the wolves. She had lived her whole life proving herself to her family, and still, they had turned on her. Now, a stranger stood silently at her back, and she felt more defended than she ever had by blood. Her father slammed his gavel against the table. He declared that the board would convene again in 72 hours, at 9 o'clock sharp, to vote on her removal, if she could not disprove the allegations. The room buzzed with rehearsed agreement. Grace nodded, accepting the ultimatum, though her chest tightened at the thought. 3 days to dismantle a conspiracy that had been months in the making. As the meeting dissolved, Jack guided her out with quiet precision, always a step behind, eyes scanning every exit. Grace wanted to bristle, to tell him she did not need saving. But exhaustion and betrayal weighed too heavily. She realized she had no choice. For her safety, for her company, for her very survival, she would have to let this man remain at her side. The decision was not trust, not yet, but it was the first step toward a reluctant alliance, one born from desperation, and the promise that someone, finally, was willing to stand beside her when everyone else had turned away. Grace left the boardroom with the ultimatum echoing in her head. 72 hours. It felt like a countdown ticking against her every step. Pride told her to walk alone, to push everyone out and prove she could survive the storm. But the failed brakes on her car and the look in her sister's eyes forced her to face the truth. She needed protection. Against her will, she allowed Jack Mercer to step into that role. Jack wasted no time. By the next morning, her calendar was rearranged. Routes to and from meetings were altered without explanation. And discreet cameras had been installed in her penthouse and offices. He spoke little, simply handing her a revised schedule or quietly adjusting her driver's route. To Grace, it felt invasive, like she was surrendering control to a man she barely knew. She bristled at his presence, irritated by the idea that her life now moved at his command. Jack, however, never defended himself. He let his actions speak, creating invisible layers of safety that wrapped around her life whether she acknowledged them or not. Late one night, unable to sleep, Grace insisted on visiting the company's server room. She wanted to see for herself that Health Trust's backbone was intact. The long corridors hummed with fluorescent light as they walked together, surrounded by blinking servers. The walls she had built around herself began to crack. She told Jack about the years of condescension, how she was left out of dinners where deals were made because the clients preferred the company of men, how she had to fight twice as hard for recognition her brother or sister would have been handed without question. She spoke without anger in her voice, but the exhaustion beneath it was heavy. Jack listened in silence before he shared a memory of his own. He told her about a mission overseas, about the night his unit walked into an ambush because someone on the inside had sold their location. 3 of his closest friends never came home. He lived with their faces every day, carrying the weight of betrayal as much as the scars of combat. His voice was steady, but the pain was unmistakable. For the first time, Grace saw not just a soldier or a bodyguard, but a man who understood what it meant to be undermined by those who should have stood beside you. The next evening, Jack's world collided with hers in an unexpected way. He invited Grace to stop by his apartment, only because he had no choice but to watch Maya and continue his protection at the same time. Grace hesitated at the door, unsure what to expect. Inside, the contrast struck her. Crayon drawings taped across the refrigerator. A piano in the corner with small hands clumsily pressing keys. A couch worn from use, surrounded by the small chaos of a life well lived. Maya greeted her with a smile too bright to fake, proudly showing a picture she had drawn of a castle, guarded by a knight. For Grace, it was disarming. She was used to sterile apartments with glass walls and silent views of the skyline. Here, the air felt alive, full of warmth. Watching Jack slice apples for Maya while listening to her chatter about school, Grace felt a flicker of something she had not known in years. It was not love, not trust, but it was the beginning of seeing that strength could come wrapped in gentleness. That power did not always wear a suit. She left that night still guarded, still wary of letting anyone close. Yet, as she looked back at the small apartment, she felt the first crack in her carefully built walls. Somewhere in the laughter of a child and the quiet steadiness of a soldier, she glimpsed the possibility that she was not as alone as she thought. The first thread of trust had been woven, thin but unbreakable, setting the stage for something larger than either of them could yet imagine. The parking garage was nearly empty by the time Grace finished her late meeting. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. She felt the chill in the air, the kind that warned something was off. Jack walked a few paces behind, his eyes scanning with the precision of a man who never stopped assessing danger. As they approached her car, Jack slowed. He noticed the cameras mounted near the ceiling had been covered with black spray paint. The vehicle itself was not in the same position he had left it earlier. It had been shifted by several inches. A detail most people would miss, but not him. Instinct snapped into place. He reached forward, took Grace by the arm, and pulled her behind a thick concrete column just as movement stirred near a parked van. 2 men stepped out of the shadows. Their posture was confident, but their movements betrayed a lack of discipline. Hired muscle, not professionals. One carried a metal pipe, the other held a knife low at his side. Their intent was clear. They had been waiting for her, and the plan was to make it look like a random attack in a dark garage. Jack moved with calm efficiency. He pushed Grace further into cover, his body shielding hers. Then he stepped out to face them. The first man lunged forward with the pipe, swinging wide. Jack sidestepped, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest and sending him crashing to the ground. Before the man could recover, Jack drove a knee into his midsection, forcing the air from his lungs. The second man rushed with the knife, a mistake that revealed his inexperience. Jack trapped his wrist, twisted sharply, and let the blade clatter across the floor. A strike to the elbow and a sweep of the leg sent him down hard. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. No theatrics, no wasted movement. Just precise, brutal control born from years of training. Grace watched from behind the column, her breath caught in her chest, torn between fear and awe at how quickly the threat had been neutralized. As Jack secured the men, a phone slipped from one of their pockets. The screen lit up with a message that had just been delivered. Job complete. Tell Veronica. Grace froze. Her stomach dropped as she stared at the name. Veronica. The sister who smiled across boardroom tables. The sister who had been circling her like a predator for months. She felt the sting of betrayal sink deeper than any physical blow could. Jack picked up the phone and glanced at the message. His voice was steady, almost clinical. As he looked back at her, "This is only the beginning. They tried to scare you first. Next time, they'll come harder." The words pressed down on her chest. She realized the fight was no longer confined to shareholders and public opinion. The battlefield had shifted into the shadows, into dark garages where lives could be ended in seconds. Her sister's ambition had crossed into violence, and Grace understood now that this war was about more than a company. It was about survival. She followed Jack out of the garage, the sound of her heartbeat louder than her footsteps. For the first time, she knew that her life was in real danger, and that the only thing standing between her and the abyss was the man walking silently at her side. The 42nd floor of the tower buzzed with tension long before the meeting began. Outside, reporters filled the lobby, their cameras waiting for either the downfall of a young CEO or her unexpected triumph. Inside the boardroom, the city skyline stretched across glass walls, a panorama that usually symbolized power but today felt like a stage for judgment. Grace walked in with steady steps, though her chest was tight. Jack positioned himself at the main door, his presence quiet but commanding, every sense alert to danger. The chairman called the meeting to order, and the voices of dissent rose almost immediately. Grace stood at the head of the table, her posture impeccable, and launched into her presentation. She spoke about Health Trust with conviction, explaining encryption methods, anonymization, and safeguards designed to exceed even military standards. She detailed how 300 hospitals had already signed agreements, how the system could revolutionize patient care. Some members leaned forward, curiosity breaking through their skepticism. But Veronica struck quickly. She leaned into the table, her voice calm but sharpened like glass. She accused Grace of being reckless, of pushing the launch in spite of scandal, of letting stress compromise her judgment. She painted Grace as unstable, driven by pride instead of reason. The family lawyer added weight, citing bylaws that allowed removal if a leader showed signs of psychological impairment. The room shifted as several heads nodded, already persuaded. Grace listened without flinching. When Veronica finished, she took a slow breath and produced a folder. Her voice remained steady as she laid out transaction records showing money transfers between Veronica and Damian Cross. She projected data logs that tracked unauthorized downloads of patient records to Veronica's division. Finally, she revealed a USB drive handed to her by a whistleblower, loaded with stolen files and correspondence that made the conspiracy undeniable. George, a long-standing board member with no ties to the family, confirmed under oath that he had been approached with bribes to vote against her. The room erupted. Voices clashed. Accusations flew. Chairs scraped against the floor. Veronica tried to dismiss the evidence as fabricated, her lawyer insisting it was a desperate play by a drowning CEO. Yet the proof was too detailed, too precise. Grace's calm dismantled every argument. Then the lights flickered. For half a second, the room went dark, and when the emergency lights hummed back on, a figure in maintenance coveralls stood by the service entrance. In his hand gleamed a stun weapon. Chaos broke loose as board members scrambled for cover. Jack moved before thought. In 3 strides, he closed the distance, trapping the man's wrist, redirecting the discharge into the table, and driving the attacker to the floor. The weapon clattered harmlessly aside. Jack pinned him with one knee and scanned the room, his voice cutting through the panic. "Try me." The words landed with force. Silence fell across the boardroom. Cameras mounted in the corners captured everything, evidence of not only corporate betrayal but now physical assault. Within minutes, the doors opened again, this time to agents in dark jackets. The FBI swept in, taking custody of the attacker and moving directly to Veronica. Her protests rang hollow as handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Damian Cross' name surfaced on documents and calls intercepted by investigators. The lawyer who had defended her slumped in his chair, realizing attorney-client privilege did not shield conspiracy. William, Grace's father, sat pale and broken. His shoulders sagged as he watched one daughter led away in chains while the other stood unshaken. He whispered that he had failed, that in trying to preserve his legacy, he had allowed ambition and jealousy to rot the family from within. His voice carried no authority now, only regret. The board reconvened in silence. The vote was unanimous. Grace would remain CEO. Not because she was his daughter, not because of family ties, but because she had exposed corruption and defended the company with courage no one else had shown. The room shifted from hostility to reluctant respect. Outside, the media lights still blazed, but inside the tower, a different light settled over Grace. She had not only survived the trial set against her, but turned it into a reckoning. Her leadership was no longer in question. As she left the room, Jack at her side, every eye followed her not as a victim of scandal, but as the leader who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of judgment. It was the silence of recognition and of power earned. The storm had passed, though traces of it still lingered in Grace's chest. After the chaos of the boardroom and the arrests that followed, she found herself standing at the doorway of Jack's apartment once again. This time, she wasn't there out of necessity. She was there because she wanted to be. The place smelled of pizza and laughter, not the sterile perfection of her penthouse. Jack had set the boxes on the small kitchen table, and Maya was already pulling out mismatched plates with the urgency only a child could bring. Grace removed her blazer and let herself sink into the scene. She laughed when Maya teased her for eating pizza with a fork, then gave in and picked up a slice with her hands. Cheese stretched, tomato sauce dripped, and for the first time in months, Grace did not care about appearances. She wasn't the CEO of a multibillion-dollar empire here. She was just another person sitting at a table, sharing food with people who welcomed her without conditions. After dinner, Maya tugged Grace by the hand toward the refrigerator. She proudly displayed a drawing taped there. 3 figures stood beneath a rainbow. One wore what looked like armor, another carried a briefcase, and between them was a small child with arms raised in joy. Grace's throat tightened as she studied it. The rainbow wasn't just a child's imagination. It was a bridge, a symbol of something fragile but growing. Maya's drawing said what words could not grace had begun to belong here. Later that night, on the rooftop garden above the apartment, the city lights shimmered below like scattered stars. The air was cool, the hum of traffic rising from the streets. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a silver fountain pen. It had once belonged to her mother, a reminder of promises whispered at a hospital bedside. She handed it to Jack without ceremony, but her eyes carried the weight of what it meant. This wasn't just gratitude, it was trust. It was a piece of her past placed in his hands as a promise for the future. Jack turned the pen over slowly, his fingers careful as if holding something sacred. He slipped it into his shirt pocket and gave her a quiet nod. No speeches, no declarations. The gesture was enough. In that moment, he was no longer only her protector. He was her partner, the one she could lean on when the battles ahead grew heavy. They stood side by side, looking out over the skyline. Grace felt lighter than she had in years. For so long she had carried everything alone, believing trust was a weakness and vulnerability, an invitation for betrayal. Now, she understood that strength also meant letting someone stand beside you. She didn't have to face the world alone anymore. Maya's laughter drifted up from inside the apartment, filling the night with warmth. Grace smiled, realizing the little girl had given her something her family of blood never had: acceptance. Jack broke the silence, his voice calm but steady. The same words he had spoken in the boardroom carrying a new meaning now. Try me. It was no longer a challenge hurled at enemies. It was a promise. Try to harm what we are building. Try to break the family we are becoming. The vow was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Grace let the words settle into her heart. For the first time, she believed them. She wasn't just a CEO fighting for a company anymore. She was part of something greater. Together, they were a family, ready for whatever storm would come next. And under the glow of the city, with a child's rainbow taped to a refrigerator below, the future looked brighter than it ever had before.